4HistoryBuffs. I'm Maria. I was the one who sort of tried desperately to keep this thing afloat last month when Paulette was away. And so, but now I have her supervision, so it's a little more comfortable. So our speakers today are from the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, which is special particularly to me because I first interned there the summer before I left for college, and it's what got me started in museums and history and libraries, and look at me now. So, yeah, and then after I graduated, I came back and did some more volunteering, just sort of hung around and was like, please, use me for something. And they did, quite a bit. So, I will read the introductions to our speakers, and then I'll just get going. All right, so Emma Sieh is the curator over there. Started sometime last year, right? November 2020. Oh, okay. So, longer than that. What a time to start. All right. Emma started her work in museums 8 years ago as a collections volunteer for a military aviation museum in Washington State. From that first volunteer opportunity, she continued to follow her passion for museum work as collections manager at Heritage Flight Museum, while doing consulting projects for a special collections library and an Australian exhibition design company, before receiving her master's degree in museum studies with a focus on collections and exhibition development. After graduating, she moved to Maine and was the curator at a historic textile mill museum for 3.5 years. She has since moved back west to Missoula and is now the curator of collections at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. And Christiana Eilson has been the Director of Education for the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula for 8 years. She received a BA in Anthropology from Scripps College, an MPhil in Medieval Archaeology from the University of Glasgow, and an MA in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester. Good job. Before making the move to Montana, she was an archaeologist in Scotland, worked for California State Parks, and headed the education department at the Guadalupe River Park Conservancy in San Jose, California. Her biggest passion in museum education is to make history come alive for people of all physical and cognitive abilities.
Okay, so who we already talked a little bit about that. I'm Christiana, this is Emma, and we would like to say that the Historical Museum acknowledges that we're in the homelands of the Salish and Kalispel people, and we offer our respect for their history and culture and for their wisdom in caring for this place for generations to come. So before we get started, there's a couple of terms that I wanted to introduce to you guys, because a lot of times Emma and I will kind of go back and forth between the terms, and it's easier if you know them ahead of time. So when we talk about internment, I spelled it wrong, but when you talk about internment camps, a lot of times people use that as the term for all of the camps, but we'll learn later that the preferred word is incarceration camp for the bigger camps. For our camp for Fort Missoula, we say internment camp because there's a special legal thing that happened. So it's a little bit different from when they moved all of the Japanese Americans off the West Coast. You'll also sometimes hear concentration camp because that bigger move was just based on ethnicity. And relocation center also used for the camps we call incarceration camps now. DOJ stands for Department of Justice, which Fort Missoula was a Department of Justice camp. And WRA stands for the War Relocation Center. So don't worry, we will go through all of that, but I just wanted to start those ideas percolating through your brains before we got started.
There's not a pop quiz, we swear.
Right. That's actually how you leave. You have to be able to answer those correctly. Okay, so basic Fort Missoula history. That's you.
All right, let's make sure. There we go. All right, so yeah, we kind of wanted to give a background of where Fort Missoula in general kind of was, how it came to be the Alien Detention Center that we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about today. So wanted to kind of go over how did Fort Missoula even become a thing? And pardon me using my notes, my brain is not as functioning as I wanted it to today. So we start out in the 1870s at the beginning of the fort. These are some of the original fort maps when it was first being kind of organized as a military reservation. And this really came to be because as white settlers were moving into this area, they were displacing the Native Americans from their tribal homelands, obviously. And some of the bands were indeed resisting that movement onto smaller reservations. And so the townsfolk of Missoula started having some fear. They started fearing that the skirmishes with the bands would get out of hand far too much for what they would be able to handle themselves. So they really did just, I mean, despite the fact that they were stealing and cheating from the Native Americans, which was causing some of those skirmishes, but they essentially pled with the military to create a fort here for safety. So Colonel Merritt chose 3 possible locations here in Missoula. He scouted out quite a few, but he decided to place it right where our fort obviously ended up being, so kind of south of the downtown area. That's directions, man. So the first troops arrived in June 1877, and that's 2 months before the Battle of Big Hole, in case you've heard of that big battle near here. And the 3rd Infantry was kind of the first key infantry troop that was actually located at Fort Missoula. They arrived after that battle and were immediately set to work on building the permanent establishment encampment at Fort Missoula. They mainly acted kind of as almost like a police force to keep the peace between the natives and the white settlers. The fort obviously gained a little bit more of the notoriety in 1878 with the Bicycle Corps, which we're not going to talk about, but is a
98.
Thank you, my note was wrong, 1898. So we're not going to talk about that today, but it is a lovely, fascinating part of history. And then past that, there was really no significant need for the fort to exist. They kind of just kept having troops come do some work here and there. They settled disputes, they were escorting trains, and it really honestly was a bit like a fort without a purpose. Into the next era, the 1900s to the 1930s, there was some major construction and renovation at the fort prior to World War I. So that officers' row, or that you see in that top photo there, that was some of the newer construction that you would see on the fort grounds. A lot of those buildings are still standing today, so they're kind of the buildings that we would all recognize at this point as Fort Missoula. During World War I, the fort was used as a training camp for mechanics. The War Department at that time, since it was still a place that didn't really have a purpose, the War Department continued to refuse proposals from other folks who did want to use the camp for other purposes, including one from the University of Montana, and the Forest Service also wanted the space and unfortunately got turned down. It's like they had an idea something would happen, who's to say. In the 1930s, that is when the CCC moved in. They decided to use Fort Missoula as a district office for it was called the Fort Missoula District of the CCC. And during that time, there was even more construction done and a lot of barracks buildings being built. So a lot of places for people to be on the fort grounds. So that pennant that you see on the screen there is part of our collections. We have a couple of the pennants, hats, caps, and stuff like that. And while we don't have a lot of that history at HMFM, our neighbor at the fort, the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History, knows all about CCC things, and there's quite a bit to know, as you can imagine. That pictorial review of the CCC is also an archival document that is in our collections as well. I tried to pepper those in to the presentation as best I could. That's you.
I think that's me, and I think I'm turned on again. I just drank out of your water bottle. I knew we were going to do this. This one's mine. I was like, I thought my water bottle was more full than that. Yeah, that's because I was drinking Emma's. Okay, so fast forward a few years, so the end of the CCC era. At that point, FDR was already concerned with folks that were of Japanese descent that were living in the United States. So there was a lot of surveillance going on of
Japanese people, Japanese Americans, Italians, Germans, folks that were getting involved in the war, but we were still trying to cling to that Lend-Lease Act where we could help our allies by loaning them equipment, ships, and that sort of thing to protect us by protecting our allies, but that we're trying to stay out of the war, basically. So in the midst of that, the FBI is creating a list of potentially dangerous enemy aliens, and we'll learn more about that when we talk more about the Japanese that were here. But this is sort of the time moving up to this. Does anybody recognize this cartoon here? Have you guys seen it before? Okay, but you recognize the author, right? Dr. Seuss? Yep, so, you know, Dr. Seuss had a lot of great kids' books, but also was part of the time. And so we can see in that picture we have a whole line of caricatured Japanese folks picking up some dynamite from someone who's looking for the signal from back home. So this is sort of the atmosphere going into World War II about Japanese Americans that were living on the West Coast. Okay. Yes? Oh, sorry about that. ABC is how they ranked how dangerous the Japanese folks were. So if you were on the A list, you were the most suspicious. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the Japanese internees that were here. Okay, all right, keep jumping just right back to you because we're at the organization of the Alien Detention Center. That's me? Okay. Oh, just kidding. See, we split it up and then I forgot what it was. So I give the tours on the site, and I was joking with Emma, like, I know how to do this when I'm walking around because the buildings tell me what order to talk in. But when you give me a slideshow, I'm like, I don't know which way to do this. Okay. So we have a picture here of Fort Missoula in 44. And so to orient you, let me see. You got to orient me first. Heritage Hall is here. So if you guys have been there, and then our museum's way up there, and that big field is where all of our borrowed buildings are, so like our schoolhouse and that sort of thing. And then the regional headquarters for the Forest Service now is these two buildings there. And so behind all of that is where the rest of the fort was built for the internment camp. So as Emma was saying, we had this infrastructure left over from the CCC era, and so it made it the perfect place to put an internment camp. When they decided that we needed some place to put potentially dangerous enemy aliens, they looked for federal land like the fort that wasn't super important. And then once we got the Italians there, which we'll get to, the Italians had the job of putting up all of these barracks. And then you can just about see in this picture the outline of the barbed wire fence that was around just the residential areas of the fort. Okay. So, all right, so these photos here are mostly of the Italians that were at Fort Missoula. So it might surprise you if you guys haven't already looked into this history, that the Italians came to Fort Missoula in spring of 1941, so a few months before we actually joined the war. And the reason they were there is because they were all folks that were either on ships, like they were merchant marines, or they were working at the World's Fair, say as a waiter or something like that. And they were young men, and Britain said that they wouldn't guarantee safe passage back to Italy for any men of fighting age. And at the same time, we had the Espionage Act that said it was illegal for anyone to destroy or damage a ship, whether it was our ship or a foreign ship. So they were able to pass a law that made it so that all the Italian and German and Danish sailors had to leave those ships. And at that point, they'd been stuck on those ships for some of them up to 18 months. So they were pretty darn bored in there. And so no wonder they started destroying the ships. But so then they took the ships and they were able to kind of give those to our European allies. But then you had all of these young men from these ships and had to figure out what to do with them if you couldn't send them back to Italy. So at that point, they said, oh, look, your visas have expired. You've been in the US too long. We can arrest you. And so that meant that they were under the control of the Department of Justice. And at that point was, or just before this, was when the Army gave the fort over to the Department of Justice. So that's why we talk about Department of Justice camps
and Immigration and Border Patrol when we're talking about Fort Missoula of this era, because that's who was administering it. So we can see in these photos some of the men unloading their stuff and building some of the barracks and newer buildings that they would need, and some of the guys kind of hanging out on their ships. Now, maybe some of you guys have heard when they got off the ships and they got to Fort Missoula, well, actually, they went from the ships to Ellis Island and then a train to Fort Missoula. So by the time they got here, they'd already been on their ships for a long time, and then in Ellis Island, and then on a train. So they're pretty happy when they got here, and a lot of them said, oh, que bella vista, it's so beautiful here. I mean, it's basically this time of year in Missoula is a nice place to be.
And hilariously enough, the fencing didn't actually even get finished around the, what would then be the internment camp until a day before they arrived. So they were really scrambling to get it finished before the Italians officially showed up after their long train ride.
So a lot of the stories that we'll talk about are pretty positive about the fort, but it's important to remember that they did still have these giant towers with armed Border Patrol agents, and they did have these tall barbed wire fences. So they were still cut off, and they didn't have freedom of movement without permission. Let's see. And just another couple photos there showing sort of the mass of Italians hanging out by the fence.
We just wanted to show you as many cool photos as we had, and all these black and white photos are also from the museum collections as well. So again, we wanted to show some stuff off.
Okay, so loyalty hearings. I'm doing this, yes? Okay. So we talked about the Italians. The story was a lot different for the Japanese. So for the Japanese folks, they weren't just in the wrong place. Well, they kind of were. The Italians were very much in the wrong place at the wrong time, just on a ship. The Japanese folks were on that ABC list that we referenced earlier. So they were people who were living on the west coast of the United States, and they were influential in their community. So not necessarily like they were going out and doing sabotage or anything like that, but they had affiliations with Japanese cultural organizations. Maybe they taught Japanese, maybe they taught kendo or judo, maybe they were in the haiku society. Things like that would get you on the ABC list. So when we look at it objectively, these are all things that made them good leaders in their community. But because we were about to go to war with Japan, they were someone that those qualities made them dangerous in the eyes of the government. So the Italians were here, they couldn't leave. That was bad. The Japanese were here, they couldn't leave, and they had to go through a loyalty hearing where they sat in front of a panel of men, and we have a replica of the courtroom here. They wouldn't have had to be in front of a panel of cute children, thankfully, but there are some cute children on a field trip. So that's our courtroom. Has anybody been to the courtroom at Fort Missoula? Okay, excellent. Lee, a couple of us. Yeah, Blanche. So the courtroom is a whole nother story altogether, but it's been restored with a grant so that it looks like it did back in the 1940s. So the building that it's in is called T1. It was the post headquarters, and that courtroom was set up for court-martial hearings for the Army. But then when they transferred it over to the Department of Justice, they decided they needed to do these hearings for the Japanese folks to see if they were loyal. Now, most of the time, if you or I would ever have to go in front of a judge, we would probably have a lawyer. We would probably know what the charges were against us, and we would have access to the evidence against us. But this hearing, well, wasn't that kind of a hearing. So they were, just imagine being, say 60, 70 years old, and sitting in front of a panel of men that you hadn't met before, and they start asking you questions, like on that questionnaire that was over here. And it's a lot of questions that are seem kind of innocuous, like how long have you been in the United States, things like that. But also, how many times have you traveled back to Japan? Were you ever in the military? Did you ever donate money to the military? Now, many of you may have been in the military or have family members that are in the military. It's pretty normal to donate to a veterans group. And a lot of the men who were at this point, 60, 70 years old, been in the US for 30 or 40 years, had been in the military in Japan when they were like 18 or 19. But the fact that they contributed to their veterans group was another tick against them. So all of these questions, they were being asked. English isn't their first language. They're standing there, and that's going to decide whether or not they get to go to where their families are or if they're sent to yet another internment camp. So it was probably a pretty stressful place to be. So that's one of the main differences between the Italians and the Japanese, is the Italians were just kind of here and stuck, whereas the Japanese had to go through that loyalty hearing, and then they got shipped off to a different internment camp. Okay. Me? Yeah. Okay. All right, so backing up a little bit to our Italian detainees, did anybody know Umberto Benedetti or Alfredo Chipolato, or the Chipolato families? Okay, so you guys all probably have much better stories than I do, and please tell me them afterwards. But as you guys know, the men who were, the Italian men that were here were fairly young when they were here. Their average age was about 25, whereas of the group of Japanese folks, their average age was 60. So they come off the boat, off the boats to the trains, to the fort, and they've already been living in bunks. They already have a hierarchy set up because they have ship captains and things like that. So it's fairly seamless moving into Fort Missoula. And the director of the camp, Nick, I never know how to say his name. Do you know? Kohler? Kohler? Yeah. He was pretty smart. He decided that he would try to keep that hierarchy. So he had the Japanese elect a mayor. He had the Italians elect a mayor. And so the mayors of each part of the camp handle the day-to-day discipline and the running of everything. And then they would give their grievances to their mayor, who would then talk to the directors. They had a pretty good setup there. So that ensured that they would have good quality food and things like that.
They had actually set up not even just mayors. They had a bunch of other folks that it was kind of a full hierarchical structure. Like we would have a city council, now, that kind of thing. So there were a bunch of people that you would go to with your grievances or what you would want or need, medical issues, anything like that. And so, yeah, it was a lot of hierarchical stuff that they already, were able to have in place, which was really lovely. And the one, I assume Christiana will mention it eventually, but there were also some folks who came over from the World's Fair. So they were all working at the World's Fair as entertainers or cooks or, anything like that as well. And those folks also came over. And I'll talk a bit more about why those folks were especially interesting in the daily fort life.
Excellent. Those of you guys already mentioned that some of you knew Umberto. He was born in Italy in 1911. He was on the Conte Biancamano and later stayed here. I believe he was able to join the Army, and that's how, or maybe Navy. Oh, shoot, I can't remember. I shouldn't get those mixed up. So he was in the military and did 2 tours in Korea, and then later worked at the UM print shop, and in between was all over Montana and went to university in Seattle and just became a real fixture in our community. And it's just interesting to know, sort of the twist of fate that brought him here. Anybody have a good Umberto story? I know he liked to paint. I've seen many of his paintings. Does anybody have an Umberto painting? Yeah? No. Oh, you like to sing too, yes. Both, actually, I heard that Alfredo Chipolato also liked to sing, so they both had that, right? And I've seen Umberto's name in the, you're going to talk about life, at the fort, right? So when they had concerts and things, his name's all over those, and I think, and Mr. Chipolato was the same situation there, as he also really enjoyed singing. And the Chipolato family, he married Anne DeRozzi, and then Miss Anne's dad owned an Italian market before Alfredo started the Broadway market. And Anne's dad's store actually supplied Fort Missoula, so they had that connection to the original Italian grocer here too. And then he passed away in 2008. Did you guys go to the Broadway market when it was there? Yeah, I'm sad I didn't move to Missoula until 2013, so I missed out on that, but I heard it was pretty great.
Chipolato was also actually part of the Missoula Symphony Chorale as well.
And we have an exhibit about the Missoula Symphony at the museum right now, so little plug for that. I saw some pictures when I was researching too. Cool. Yeah, see, this is great. I knew they would know stories. And then quick window on the Japanese detainees. We already mentioned that their average age was a lot later. They got here for different reasons, and they had the added, so I suppose the Italians had big stress because their families were home in Italy and there was war. And then the Japanese had stress because they were taken away from their families, and then later their families were sent to those big war relocation authority camps. So they each had to worry about their families, but on different levels. That's a great question. I believe it's about 1,200, is that right? We had about 1,000 Italians and about 1,000 Japanese folks as well. The Japanese kind of came in like waves and were moved to other places, whereas the Italians stayed put for the duration. One of the Japanese folks that we know a lot about is Mr. Yasui. He was born in 1886 in Japan, and he moved to the US in 1903, so he was here for quite a long time before World War II. At that point, you couldn't become an American citizen if you were born in Japan. There were laws so that you had to be white to become a naturalized citizen. So even though he, came here and did the whole American dream thing, it was never an option for him to become a citizen. Now, his children that were born in the US were automatically American citizens. He was a respected orchardist in Hood River and had a store, made a lot of good connections between the Japanese community, Japanese-American community, and the white community there. And in that second picture on the left, he's getting like an award cup from the Japanese council or embassy to sort of just recognize in the 1920s how much he had fostered that commerce between Japanese and white folks. And unfortunately, that was one of the things that put him on the ABC list, is he'd gotten that award, so he had that connection. He also had a bunch of kids who were very successful, and one of his sons, Min Yasui, was the first Japanese American to pass the bar in the state of Oregon. And so his son actually challenged the internment all the way to the Supreme Court. And so that was great that he did it, but bad for his dad because our government wasn't really fond of him or his son. So he ended up being bounced around between different army camps and internment camps until a few months after the war was over. He fought for the passage of the McCarran-Walter Act, which was the one that made it possible for Japanese folks to become naturalized citizens, and he became a citizen in 1954. But this whole trauma of going through internment, losing all of his land and business and all that sort of thing was super stressful, and he ended up committing suicide in 1957. So, and unfortunately, that's we had about 120,000 people that were taken from the West Coast and put into these internment camps or incarceration camps, and unfortunately, you get a fair amount of stories, especially from the older generation. So this is a map of where all Mr. Yasui's kids ended up and his family. So you can see he had, what did he have, 8 kids or something like that?
Yeah, I think
he had a ton of kids, and he was Methodist, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so. Everybody started out there up in the top of Oregon in Hood River. Just before the war, when there was all the rumblings that the Army was going to have all the Japanese Americans removed, a couple of his kids went off to different states before the internment camp started, and they went to college and things like that. But his wife and his youngest 2 kids ended up going from Hood River to an assembly center in California, and then up to Tule Lake Camp in California. In the meantime, Mr. Yasui's gone from Hood River up to Fort Missoula, and then he goes through his loyalty hearing and gets sent all the way down to Oklahoma and then Louisiana, and then finally reunites with his family in Crystal City there. And in the meantime, they're doing all of these things like getting education releases for the kids so they can go meet folks in Denver, and they all never end up quite in the same space again, and they don't all go back to Hood River. Actually, nobody goes back to Hood River at that point, except for one son, I think, and everybody. So it really just completely changed the trajectory of his family
Yeah, that map is actually in one of our current exhibits at the museum, our Looking Like the Enemy exhibit, which is the name of this presentation. But we had a lovely education intern put all that together, which is lovely. But also amongst that exhibit, we have artifacts that were donated to us from the Oregon Historical Society from Yasui's store. So we have some of the original signs, some similar goods that would have been sold there. So there is also some neat stuff to see if you want to, come to visit the museum. Shameless plug.
It's free for Missoula County residents.
Yeah.
And then just a little side note, even if you've heard us tell this story before, you might not be as familiar with the Japanese Latin Americans who were at Fort Missoula. Has anybody heard of that? Okay, so that's one that even we are just learning more about in the last 5 years. So our government, the US government, recognized that we would have this need to be able to trade prisoners between us and Japan. And so we wanted to have Japanese nationals that we could trade for American nationals that were in Japan. So at the same time, Peru was having some trouble with racism against Japanese folks, and Peruvians were just like not really loving having all of these Japanese immigrants that had moved to Peru. So the US government sent the Navy down, and the Peruvian, I think it was in multiple cities, but say Lima, for example, their police came and they had their own ABC list, and they arrested all of the folks that were on the list that were like basically the Mr. Yasuis of Peru, who happened to be from Japan. And then they put them on a ship and they took them back up to the United States, and then they were supposed to be traded to Japan for American prisoners, but Japan didn't want them. Because they weren't even, they had left Japan and moved to Peru, so why did Japan want them? So they ended up basically stateless in the United States because they had had to give over their passports when they got on the American ships, and then they got sent to the United States and kind of bounced around internment camps. So we had quite a handful of our younger internees, really, who were from Peru. An example that we have that was here was this man named Arthur, who he had a really terrible story. His boss was the one on the list, but his boss bribed a police officer to take him instead. And so he ended up getting taken. And he went through Panama. He went to a camp in California. He was nearly deported to Japan, where he had, cousins and things like that, but no close relatives. And there was a lawyer who worked really hard to get everybody who was on that list let out at that point, and then he ended up going to work in New Jersey on some sort of work exchange. But there's a bunch of stories like that. So just another one where you think you know everything about a story, and then something like this pops up and you start hearing stories about that.
Yeah. And that idea of being kind of a stateless citizen was really a point of contention as well for the Japanese internees, because they were not able to become American citizens prior to the war happening, and so there was a lot of media going around saying, well, they should have just become American citizens. Why? Obviously they didn't want to give up their Japanese heritage or their Japanese citizenship. And, well, if you think about it, if they would have given up their Japanese citizenship, they couldn't become American citizens, they would have been stateless and been very much in a similar situation. So there were points in the loyalty hearings and kind of on the questionnaire where they brought up that fact.
Right, why didn't you become a citizen? And they were like, we can't.
Yeah.
I'm not allowed to.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the other ones that was a really big question that people were trying to sort out was when they moved to the U.S., because of course they were not allowed to immigrate to the U.S. past 1925, 4 or 5, something like that. And so they really were trying to nail down exactly what year did they get here, because otherwise it would be a quick deportation if they happened to be coming around after the fact. Mm-hmm. So. Just thought I would add in those slight other things before I take over to talk about life at the fort. So obviously we've talked about who was there, why they were there, but now what are they doing while they're spending all of their days at Fort Missoula? So to preface this, their kind of experiences really relates very specifically to the Geneva Convention. Obviously, those were already in place at that point in time, and the idea was that we wanted to treat these prisoners while they were here in Fort Missoula as best we could, because we didn't want our prisoners of war elsewhere, so in Japan, overseas, to be treated poorly. It was kind of that, well, if we treat yours nice, you treat ours nice kind of idea. So we're going to go through, and you know, the kind of sad fact of it is a lot of the photographs and some of the stories does make it seem a bit more like it was a summer camp, but you just got to always remember, keep in the back of your brain, they were not there by choice and they did not want to be there. So the barracks that we've seen a couple photos of, they were those long buildings on the fort grounds. So a lot of those had been built prior to anyone showing up at the fort. As we mentioned, there was a lot of construction happening, especially during the CCC era, but the Italians did build another 13 barracks buildings on the grounds. And so even by 1941, there was enough barracks buildings to house all of the Italians that were showing up. And so a lot of those extra barracks buildings were for the Japanese that would eventually arrive. The standard government issue barracks buildings were quite literally those that kind of come in on a pallet, just get put together. They're all very standard, all very much the same. And they all housed about between 40 to 60 men each, especially for the Italians. It might actually be about 30 to 40 more on average for the Japanese internees. And it's said that they have about a minimum of 40 square feet per man. But if you look at this photo here, their bunks were very close together, and there was sometimes points where you really couldn't even hop down off the top bunk very well with the stuff that was around on the floor, other furniture, that kind of stuff. It doesn't really look like 40 square feet to me, at least. So many of the, you can kind of see that they had almost like a little street leading up to the entryway of their barracks buildings, and so a lot of the internees, especially the Japanese, actually started planting gardens outside the barracks buildings as well. They like to keep their spaces as immaculate as possible, versus Italians were said to be a little more grimy, unfortunately. There were separate barracks for the Italians and the Japanese. On purpose, they were separated, but they also really did not want to have anything to do with each other anyway, so they did indeed have completely separate buildings as well. Every 10 dorms had this is a fact I only just learned yesterday, every 10 dorms had their own mess hall, bathrooms, and showers. So oh gosh, I can't even remember exactly how many barracks buildings were on the grounds, but so they did have multiple facilities per kind of groups of folks. So that is where they were staying. But what were they eating? So Christiana did bring up the Durazzi's. I don't know, is it Durazzi?
I say Durazzi, but I don't know.
Cool, yeah, Durazzi, anyone? Durazzi, that's okay, what I, so the photos on here are kind of more specifically of the Italian mess hall. So up top you can see it is empty, it is filled underneath, but you can kind of see the type of food that they were actually being fed there. As Christiana pointed out, the Durazzi grocery, which that's my favorite ad I've ever seen of it. It was the famous bar and also grocery. They were indeed supplying the groceries to Fort Missoula. I don't think they were the only ones, but they were definitely the main supply, like one of the larger suppliers. And folks from Durazzi's, as well as the internees, as well as other people in Missoula, had really bad feelings about this, mostly because the internees were getting fed pretty darn well. That tray that you see right there is actually of an internee holding what was his Christmas dinner. And so they were able to get access to a lot of the foods that were rationed for regular Missoulians. So they did get rice, oil, sugar, all of those kinds of things. Meat is a big one. Yeah, there was a story that one of the guards said that they couldn't even get a hamburger, whereas the internees got a steak, which is very interesting. So they were able to be fed pretty well. I'm going to check my notes. Oh, obviously no alcohol was allowed, but tobacco was very important, especially for the Italian internees. And again, separate mess halls for the Japanese and Italians.
Can I tell a funny alcohol story?
Yes.
Okay, so
I get these stories from other folks that have done research and things, but so take it with a grain of salt. I'm not sure that this is entirely true. But, so as she just mentioned, at least at first, they weren't allowed to have alcohol, but they could ask for certain things from the kitchen. So the Italians asked for a lot of apples. They said, sure, we'll get you apples. They get them apples. All the Italians are drunk because they made Applejack. Okay, you can't have any more apples. Sorry, fine, understood. Could we have some plums? Sure, we'll have some plums. Next thing you know, they make plum wine. And they're like, no, you can't do that. Okay, and I think finally at one point they did end up selling beer at the commissary, which was in Heritage Hall, because they were just like, okay, we can't win, we'll just do this. One more funny food story. Although they were very separate and they had, they catered to the sort of cultural food needs of the Italians and the Japanese. So Italians were getting pasta and olive oil and that sort of thing, and Japanese were getting rice and fish. But they had sort of limited amounts that they could ask for. So at some point, the sort of cook who ordered for the Italians and the cook that ordered for the Japanese got together, and they were like, okay, I'll ask for more olive oil if you ask for more rice. And so they did a little trade-off there. So especially when there were fewer Japanese there, I think there was a little bit more interaction between them. But they were, as Emma said, pretty separate. Okay. Just to give you an idea of what a typical day would look like for an internee, they would rise between 7 to 9 a.m., they would eat in shifts, they would spend essentially the rest of the day killing time. So they would walk the grounds, they would rest in their bunks, they would rest in the grass, they would do handiwork and art, and we'll show that in just a minute, play music, sports, that kind of stuff. They did have jobs that they did, which I'll jump ahead to do that one really quick. So they had essentially, the idea was that they would be kind of doing their job, or pulling their weight, that's what I was trying to say, pulling their weight while they were there. So they would have chores, essentially, that they would rotate the jobs for. So things like the laundry, the cooking, that's a tailor shop in the top left corner there. And there were also points where they could also do blacksmithing or carpentry to kind of do more helpful things on the fort grounds as well. But then by 5 p.m. they had their supper, and they usually, especially for the Italians, and especially when they were there by themselves, it was usually the time for music on the fort, and we'll talk about that in a second. But going back to medical care, so that beautiful, amazing painting is the post-hospital building. That was built in, 1911? It was in that kind of major new construction that was happening right after the turn of the century. And that particular painting, a lovely plug, was actually done as an open-air painting by an artist here from town, Mary Beth Wilhelm. These were on display in our museum last fall, and I just love that painting so much. It's one of my favorites. But that is where a lot of the medical care happened. Unfortunately, when the camp was first set up, there actually was not a formal hospital or medical bay, and because the building that was there had kind of burned down. So they were really struggling to kind of sort out the medical care system. And honestly, Nick Collier, the head of the fort, had an absolute nasty time trying to find eye doctors and dentists that would come regularly to work with the internees. They were assigned a fort doctor that did stay for quite a while, but unfortunately the first fort doctor they had, Dr. Smiley, was a bit of a curmudgeon. I think they called him sadist. Sadist. A troublemaker is the nice way to say it as well. He actually caused quite a few problems. He was incredibly disrespectful to all of the internees that he was caring for. He often told them that they were making stuff up, that they didn't actually have any of their ailments, that they didn't need any of the medical care. He often refused care to certain folks, and to the point where he actually kind of was the cause of there were only 2 at the fort during this time, but one of the riots that happened at the fort. He happened to post a letter that someone had wrote something nice about him, so he posted it outside, and it unfortunately ignited a lot of the kind of anti-fascist and pro-fascist sanctions of the Italians especially, and everyone got a little heated. And then he, of course, then inserted himself into the situation and made it worse, as you do. So, he was not the best. They did get another doctor who was originally his assistant, Dr. Brown, I think was his name. And so while they did a lot of the procedures here, and eventually this was a fully functioning hospital, some of the internees, especially early in the years, were being sent to St. Pat's right here in downtown. All right, so we're getting to some of the fun stuff. So Internee Art, as we said, the internees were essentially trying to kill time a lot of the time, and a lot of the folks that were there at Fort Missoula had a great passion for art, and whether they had it prior to their encampment is up for question. A lot of them said they kind of got essentially, the FBI made a photographer out of me was one of the quotes from one of the Italians. This particular image right here is of the Japanese and of their favorite art pastime. It was nicknamed Stone Fever, had kind of went through the fort, and they really enjoyed, especially as the winter left and they were able to see all of the stones on the grounds as the snow melted. They were picking up those rocks and stones on the grounds, bringing them to the shower, rubbing them on the ground of this concrete ground of the shower to polish them up, rub them down with their government issue blankets, and then they started making things with them. So they made jewelry, vases, ashtrays, all of those things that you can see right there. It had gotten to the point where they had actually made so many cool things that they actually had mini exhibits, stuff like this. So tables like this, or in the mess hall, they sometimes had them kind of on display as well. And it was kind of their way to still do creative. It was just hilarious that they call it Stone Fever, because some of the wives of the Japanese internees actually thought there was a fever going through the fort, and they were very concerned about the health of the internees, and they had to quickly kind of clear that up, that it was not a disease. It was instead just a fun art pastime. The Italians definitely had quite a penchant for art and things like that. So one of the things they spent a lot of their time doing were building ship models. They obviously, especially liked the sailors that were there, liked to build the models of their ship that they were on prior to coming to Fort Missoula. And they were pretty skilled woodworkers and probably had done it quite a bit prior to being here. That image in the center, the color image there, is one of the ship models that an internee made. That is in our collections. We have about 10 internee model ships in our collections. This one in particular has its own little backing, which is super neat. Like, they kind of created a scene with it. Some are, you can see in that bottom right-hand photo, some are kind of standalone models like you would regularly see. We have some of those as well.
We have one on display that is a night light. So if you plugged it in, all the little portholes would have light in it.
Yeah. So other than the shipbuilding, there was quite a bit of painting going on. There was a point where you'll see on the back of some of the paintings, they even had kind of like a print or framing shop at the fort where they were making the frames for these paintings. Those 3 paintings that you see on the side there are actually in the museum collections. We have about 16 of the original paintings, a lot of which were done by Benedetti. Some are from other various folks. Some didn't sign them, so it's kind of hard to tell. But the paintings were definitely one of the other things that folks did quite often while they were at the fort. Let's see if I'm forgetting a major thing in my brain. Oh, many of these kinds of the models, these paintings, we actually just recently got a new donation to the museum that was a painted rock. Someone had taken one of those polished rocks that the Japanese had found and painted it and then given it as a gift. A lot of these got essentially back to us because they were given as gifts or in return for services. I've even heard that some of the paintings were given to the dentist that would come and help them sometimes. So that's kind of how they ended up coming back to us as well, is that they were not really left behind, but rather kind of through 14 people, the Kevin Bacon number, as it were. So I know I've been alluding to music this whole darn time. This is where we're going to talk to it. Music and plays as well. That bottom photo is of Benedetti. You saw the close-up version of that photo in Christiana's slide earlier. But as we said, a lot of the folks that there was a significant amount, like couple hundred musicians at Fort Missoula. So either they were the musicians from the World's Fair especially, but there were also just obviously professional musicians on some of the cruise ships, which is also some of the ships that were being brought, had their sailors and Italians brought to Fort Missoula. And so, as I said, evenings were full of music. They sometimes did fun little, like, nighttime things. The quartets would have their own, you know, time to do their thing. They would go across the grounds, find another area to set up some music. But some of the music and performances were actually also offered to Missoulians as well. Part of that was trying to ease some of the tensions, as we've talked about, you know, when you have folks who are getting fed really well, who don't have to work, who, you know, all of that. You can imagine that the tensions were rising amongst Missoulians here in town for those in the camps. So they decided to offer musical performances. What they're getting ready for here is actually plays that were also done. And that gorgeous building that we're looking at was the rec center that was on the grounds, which unfortunately no longer exists. It indeed did burn down to the ground. But I love that photo because you can see how amazing the set designs were. So they had all of this pulled together as well. And then, of course, sports. Sports was a major part of their life. It was also a great way for them to kind of get their athletic activity to do a thing. And so some of the more popular sports were bocce, as you can see there. That it's kind of hard to tell in that top middle photo. That is actually a baseball game that they're playing right there. The photo below it is a kind of overhead view of the one of the soccer games. They actually did have kind of like, they set up their own almost like professional style teams and had tournaments and things like that. So that is one of the professional portraits for the one of the soccer teams of the Italians.
I heard a funny story from a grandson of an internee who played baseball, and he was Japanese. And apparently the Italians didn't play baseball, but the Japanese got really tired of beating each other at baseball, so then they taught the Italians how to play baseball so then they could beat the Italians at baseball.
Yeah.
And I guess the Italians were game. They were
Yeah, they're down to learn a new thing, I can imagine. There were some other like specialty sports. So there was some fence, I guess, but yeah, fencing happening. Some of the more wrestling, especially for the Japanese. But that center photo that you see right there is actually the map of the golf course that the Japanese actually built on the grounds of Fort Missoula, well before the current golf course that exists. And no, unfortunately, the golf course did not recreate it. It doesn't look like.
Close.
It's pretty close. But yeah, you can actually see they did set up specific holes, called it Beautiful Sky. And there were some Japanese folks that were staying there that actually said, the ones from Hawaii were like, oh, this is as beautiful as the golf courses in Hawaii that they were really, they knew a whole lot about. So definitely a lot of active stuff going on, and I know we're probably getting close to time.
Yeah.
So
there's so much to talk about, and I'm
so many
already
cool
going,
things.
oh, I wish I had told you about this and that, and so you'll just have to come out and visit me at the fort, and we'll go run around buildings. But eventually, the war did begin to come to an end, and before that, there were a series of challenges to the Supreme Court to end internment. And the lady you see there is Mitsuye Endo, who was the woman that sort of was the nail in the coffin for keeping the camps open. So our camp closed in, 45, and it became an Army prison camp at that point. But we didn't even touch the War Relocation Authority camps and the sort of larger question of internment or incarceration on the West Coast. But this lady here had worked for, I believe she worked for one of the Department of Motor Vehicles, so she had government clearance, and then they decided to use her as a test case because they said if you trusted her enough to work for the government up until the war happened, then how could she be someone that you need to keep in an internment camp? And so hers was sort of the last straw, and they were about to go before the Supreme Court, and the day before her trial, the president came out and said that they were going to close the internment camps. So at that point, all of the rest of the camps began to be closed. A lot of people had trouble figuring out what to do next because they had to sell all their things in their homes. And obviously this created a lot of trauma in families and having to restart, and it also dispersed Japanese Americans all over the country where they had been sort of concentrated in bigger cities. So there were years and years and decades of discussion about it. But in 1990, President Bush actually issued a formal apology, and then each person who was still alive that had been interned got the equivalent of being a POW for 3 years, a monetary sum. So I think it was about $20,000. And compared to the amount of money that they had all lost, you know, it was nothing. But, and a lot of the older folks who had remembered internment and were still alive were really happier to have this apology letter than the money itself. Obviously, the money was nice, but, and this was the first George Bush, and he said, "A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories, neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future." So that was sort of how it all wrapped up. But the Japanese American community continues to work hard to make sure things like this don't happen, and then we at the fort also continue this project as well. So, what's happening at the fort? We will get to that. So, as we have alluded to, we do field trips and tours for adults and school groups and community groups, visiting folks from other countries, and I think we see something like 5,000 children for field trips during our seasons.
Yeah, we have been very excited, especially, I don't know why it seemed like so many last year in particular, but we're starting to also see quite a few internee descendants come along who want to share, you know, photos or stories or kind of recollections from their parents, their, you know, relatives that were actually interned at Fort Missoula. Obviously, that's more usually a lot of the internee Italian descendants, but it's been really neat to talk to those folks as well.
We like to bring speakers from around the country, and maybe some of you guys have gone to some of our film showings. This was Holly Yasui, who unfortunately passed away of COVID, but she had done a film about her dad, Min Yasui, and I was talking about the Yasui family. And then we have Marlene Shigakawa and Yukio Shimamura who've come to do talks, and there's Yukio at Sentinel High School talking about his time. He was a teenager in Utah in one of the internment camps. So we're lucky that we get people who like Montana and they want to come out and tell their stories. And then we are also involved with several other national and international groups, like the International Coalition Sites of Conscience, the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium, and then during COVID, we were involved with 2 virtual pilgrimages where we put together videos that were then shared nationally with the descendants and people who are just interested in this. So we have a national profile.
But the exciting news on the horizon, and some of you may have seen like press releases or some of our social media about it, we are about to enter into a whole new construction project at the fort. We're calling it internally our Barracks Project. It's
catchy.
Shorter than the long actual name for the project. But basically the idea is that we are essentially creating 2 new buildings on the ground. So that overhead view that you see right there, that long building with the green roof, is the current barracks building that exists on our grounds. In the front it has the exhibit that kind of talks about internment at Fort Missoula, and the back half is collection storage. Those 2 white blocks there are going to be the 2 new buildings. So if you've been to the fort recently, you'll know that one of those buildings is technically standing at this point, and the other one is just a foundation. So we are working with A&E, their historic architects, to put together these 2 new buildings on our grounds. The one that is currently standing is one of the original barracks buildings from Fort Missoula. This one was
Is that the DNRC?
Thank you, DNRC. And so while it is standing, it is not obviously like habitable at this point, so they are going to be fully restoring it. And the inside of that building will be a fully immersive exhibit where folks can actually walk in and see what the inside of an internment barrack would have looked like. And so Christiana and I will be working pretty heavily to create a really cool experience for folks in that building in particular. The building next to it, and you can kind of see the architect's drawings there. I'm not 100%. Those are what we proposed. We'll see what actually happens. But they're going to build those buildings as close to original using photographs like some of what you've seen today as possible. That building next to the immersive exhibit is going to be for me, and I'm very excited. We are building a new state-of-the-art collection storage building for the grounds. Obviously, as you can imagine, we are currently housing all of our collections in these historic buildings that are at the fort, and so this building will be built specifically to standard best practices for collection storage, things like temperature, humidity controls, nice, clean. Sealed pests, all of that kind of stuff, and it will help alleviate our storage problems. We do have over 50,000 objects in our collection, and that number is continually growing because we're realizing that we sorely underestimated the amount of things we had. And so we need a place to store all of these and to keep them safe and to be able to show them, talk about them, do all of that kind of work. And so I'm very excited that I'll also get to kind of be putting together a space that will keep Missoula County's history alive, which is indeed our mission and goal.
And we got a really big grant from
thank you.
the National Park Service for the Japanese American Confinement Sites program that covered half?
The most
of it?
Yeah, I think the price tag was like a little over $800,000 to fully complete the project, and this grant was able to award us over $500,000, so quite a bit.
And then we've raised most of it, but I think we have about like $20,000 left. So
Yeah.
if anybody has some spare pocket change.
Yeah, so that's basically it. I know we talked for quite a while, and there was a lot we crammed in there, so.
Thank you. Do you have a question, sir?
The internees have a source of income?
If they worked off-site, so like Emma talked about, they had some jobs that were more like chores on-site, but if they worked off-site like for the Forest Service, or sometimes they would work in the sugar beet fields, doing the jobs basically that all the young men who went off to fight would ordinarily have done, then they would earn money, yeah.
I also understand my lunch today is thankful to them because I ate tagliatelle.
Yeah, there you go. In the back, yeah. Sure.
Were there Germans out there?
There were.
Were there any women out there? And were there other Italians sent to other places in the U.S.?
Great questions. So first off, yes, there were Germans. We don't know as much about the Germans. I'd say we know the most about the Italians, and then the Japanese, and then the Germans. The Germans, we had less than 500, and they were mostly transferred through Fort Missoula. Most of the German nationals were sent to Fort Lincoln in Bismarck. And they don't actually have a site, but they do talk about them in the Historical Society there. So there were some German nationals. Women, not generally. There was one case we know of where a couple got arrested. Because I don't exactly remember why. And so that couple stayed in Missoula on their way to Salt Lake City, and they were Japanese. So there was a female in that case.
But not regularly.
But not regularly.
And we didn't have any children either as well.
So there are a few pictures of our internees with children, and our thought is there was at one point folks that had decided to be repatriated, and so a train came through here and picked up some of our guys whose families were on the train. And so we have a few pictures of kids there, but they didn't stay at the fort.
There was also an opportunity for, I think, friends and family to attend the loyalty hearings as well. Like they couldn't do anything at the hearings, so there was at least a point where some family members did attend. So like Min attended his father's hearing here in Fort Missoula.
Yeah, and the lady whose name I just forgot, who's coming to visit later next month, her mom had met, so they're Italian. Her mom lived in Chicago, and the World's Fair was in Chicago. And so her mom met a guy at the World's Fair who was Italian who got sent here. And then she was able to come visit him here. So there was some visitation available, but it was pretty minor. It was also hard to get here.
In terms of Italians being elsewhere.
Oh, Italians being elsewhere. So I know there were some, I don't have numbers at this point, because there was a massive list of Italian Americans and Italians nationals that the US was keeping, the FBI was keeping an eye on. And there were restrictions on the west coast of Italians near ports and things like that. So I don't have a location. I bet there were some at Fort Lincoln and Bismarck, because we also had some Japanese folks sent there as well. And I think there was another camp there on the east coast, although they may have just used Ellis Island for that, because it would have been Department of Justice. So I don't know exact details, but yes is a short answer. There were also internment camps in Canada as well, and so they did similar things in Canada. Yeah.
Information on the Japanese, I don't really remember hearing very much about them.
That's we.
Other than transferring.
Sure. Yeah. There's not. We don't know as much. There were about 1,200 of them, and they were on that FBI list. They came here from places on the West Coast mostly. They were folks who were business owners, community leaders. They had families on the West Coast. After they were sent here, a lot of them were arrested on the day that Pearl Harbor happened, especially if you're on that top list that the FBI were worried about.
Yeah, they were on your doorstep as immediately as possible and said, okay, you can grab these 3 things and then we're leaving.
So it was especially terrifying for their families, because as soon as that bomb dropped, they knew things were going to be bad if you were Japanese or Japanese American. And then the next day, the FBI comes and takes your dad or your husband.
And of course, they didn't tell them where they were sending them. So there were a couple folks and families and stories that we've heard of where they literally, that was the last time they saw their father. They never heard from them ever again, and they didn't even know where they ended up passing away in some cases, because they kind of got bumped around, and of course the FBI wasn't going to go sharing locations of military stuff at that point.
And so most of the Japanese folks ended up at Fort Missoula in December or January. And then our camp kind of filled up, and then folks that got picked up later, they weren't as important on the FBI list, ended up at Fort Lincoln and Bismarck. So that all happened then. The Executive Order 9066, which is the one that took all of the Japanese Americans off the West Coast. So if you're 1/16 Japanese, you weren't allowed to live on the West Coast. That happened in February. So already a lot of heads of households had been sent to places like Fort Missoula, and so the rest of their families were kind of trying to make do. And then all of those folks have to sell other stuff and get sent to places like Amache or Heart Mountain or Manzanar, if you've heard of any of those. And so that's the rest of the 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans that were sent to camps. And that could be a whole nother presentation.
Yeah.
Yes?
At the end of the internment, were the people given any assistance to go where they needed to go? Or
That's a good question. There were a lot of charitable organizations. Oh, I'm sorry, sure. Her question was, at the end of internment, were people given assistance to leave the camps, like some money to get set up elsewhere? Or travel money, right.
Or transport at all.
Transport. I'll have to look it up, and I will share that with our library person. But the short answer is mostly organizations like the Quakers and some other charitable organizations set up places where they would arrange to have somebody sponsor a family, or people had family members that were already in Chicago or New York because they hadn't been sent to camps, and so they went out to those places. So they relied a lot on sponsorships. There were some universities on this side of the internment line who took students who had been like at Berkeley or UCLA or Stanford. They took some of them in, but a lot of schools didn't because they were, yes.
What happened to their properties? Like someone removed from the executive order in the West Coast, lost their farm.
They sure did, yeah.
They were reimbursed?
Just that $20,000 that, so if they were still alive when, in 1990, then they got $20,000. There are stories about neighbors, like in some cases maybe you were a German immigrant and you remembered what World War I was like and all of the discrimination against you in World War I, and so your neighbor was Japanese and being sent away, you bought their farm for $1 and then sent them the money from the farm and then sold them their farm back for $1 when they got back. So there are good stories like that, but there are unfortunately far more that are the, pennies on $1 for that. Yeah.
I have a personal association with one of the Italian internees.
Uh-huh.
Of course, I was 18 months old. My family had some property, my great-grandparents had some property in Rattlesnake, which is now the Apple Grove development.
Okay.
Before.
There you go.
The property was called Rose Acres.
Okay.
And it was Rose Acres because my great-grandmother's name was Rosemary.
Wow.
But mostly it was apple orchards and a lot of flowers. And flowers from there used to bank the altars at St. Francis. And one of the Italian internees was a man whose first name was Vincenzo. I have no idea what became of him. He was an older man, and he had been a steward on one of the Italian ships. So when they were allowed to leave and do jobs in Missoula, I believe Alfredo was an orderly at St. Pat's.
Yeah,
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Vincenzo came out to Rose Acres, and some of the time he helped in the apple orchards and on the flowers with my great-grandmother's things, and other times he would put on his uniform from being a ship's steward, and he would help her with her social parties.
Oh, fun. Wow.
And the picture in which I'm implicated, I'm in a high chair, and he is next to me putting something on the tray.
Aww. Oh, how fun. Yeah. That's great.
I'll bring you the photo if you'd like to have it.
We would love that. Yeah, we'd love to scan that. Yeah, and so there were chances for the Italians especially to be sort of paroled out to work at the hospitals and things. And also the Italians and also the Japanese could go into town with a Border Patrol agent. There's a story about one Japanese man who needed to go to the Merc. He needed some supplies. And he was pretty nervous about it because he was concerned that people were going to say mean things to him. And when he went to pay for his goods, the cashier said, "Could I ask you a question?" And he was like, "Oh no." And she said, "Are you Mexican?" Because she just hadn't seen a Japanese guy before, so she was confused. But I think there was definitely some fear of the Japanese folks. But I think on an individual basis, you got here in Missoula some nicer stories.
I think the end of that story also ends with her saying, "Well, why are you guys being held in Fort Missoula?"
Right.
And the internee was able to kind of go back with like a much happier, like, oh, bless her heart for also being confused by this, because we are also confused.
Right.
Not only being a history buff, I'm into genealogy too, and my big project for the Western Montana Genealogical Society is to catalog all the cemeteries in Western Montana. So I'm very familiar with 85,000 burials. What was the mortality of these people? Because there just really isn't anyone.
Yeah. So there were four that died at Fort Missoula, but their bodies were returned to their families.
Yeah, like one gentleman, he arrived and died like that day or the next day or something like that.
Yeah.
They're Japanese buried at the city cemetery, but they're railroad workers from Thompson Falls.
Yep.
So, and I'm trying to do a booklet if you know anybody who'd like to help me.
Okay.
And I need a translator to read the stones.
Yeah. It's a cool project. Yeah.
Was there any instruction in English for Italian?
I think so.
What did they do about the religious beliefs of the
Yep. So her question was, was there any instruction in English? Like, were they taught English, the Italians especially, since they had just gotten here? And then what were...
happened to their religious beliefs? Were they addressed?
Right, were they able, what happened to their religious beliefs? So for the Italians, again, one of the reasons why we know so much about them is the Catholic diocese in Helena, or Great Falls, whichever where it was. Helena, thank you, was very concerned about their well-being. And so they sent priests out, and they actually gave them money for Christmas, that first Christmas that they were here, so they could have stuff. And then they performed mass. So if you go to the fort and you know the big barrack buildings where the Forest Service are now, there's kind of like almost a balcony. And so the priest would stand on that balcony, and then everybody would assemble in front of them so they could do mass there when the weather was good. So they definitely respected their religious beliefs.
They also got some of the Italians to, there was kind of a drop-off, of course, as you can imagine, that, they were just like, we can't do anything. And so they kind of tried to bribe them into going back to Mass by saying, oh, well, you'll get your tobacco and cigarettes at the end of Mass. So you have to make sure you got to go and then get your tobacco as well.
And as far as the Japanese go, we had some different sects of Buddhism, and we had Methodists and different Christian folks here that were, and I don't remember, I think because of the Geneva Accords, the Geneva Convention, they would have had to have respected their religious beliefs. Off the top of my head, I can't remember reading anything specifically about that, but my guess is that they would have been given the time and the space to do that. And I know their funerals, like the picture we have of a funeral, everything is arrayed in a way that looks like it's intentional, and they had the space and the materials to do the right thing for them. So, yeah. Yes?
Do you know if any of the Italians or Japanese joined the U.S. military, either
Yes.
as interpreters or to fight in Europe?
Yeah. So the question was, did any of the internees join the military? And several of the Italians did, including Umberto Benedetti. The Japanese men were mostly older, and I don't think they would have been eligible for service because even their children, who had been in ROTC at the beginning of the war, were deemed ineligible for service. So they're not even for the draft.
Min had tried to go and enlist as well.
Min Yasui, the son that we talked about earlier, who was a lawyer, he had been ready, and they said he couldn't. Later, in those bigger internment camps, they ended up drafting out of the camps, and then some people also joined on their own. And if you've ever heard of the 442nd, that was the unit of Japanese American soldiers, and it's one of the most decorated units in military history. It is, yeah.
Yeah, isn't it like the Purple Heart? They have a nickname of something like that. I
Go
can't
for broke.
remember. Yeah.
This year, sometime around December 7th, the World Channel for PBS had a documentary called Armed with Language.
Oh.
And it was about the Japanese Americans who were inducted and trained as translators and then worked for the U.S. Army. My sister-in-law's father was one of them.
Oh, wow.
The first class was at the Presidio, and he was in the first class, and he interrogated the Japanese who had actually invaded Alaska. They there were physical, incursions into the area. That's about all I know about it. I'm not sure how he got in there. I don't think he ever spent a day in a camp. I think he was accepted before, well before that.
And if he hadn't been, do you know if he grew up on the West Coast?
He did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Say, if he hadn't
Actually,
been on the
Idaho.
Huh? What was that?
Idaho.
Oh, so he wouldn't have been sent to a camp.
Right. And he had to be taught Japanese. And it turns out that the style of Japanese they were taught was not what males used typically.
Interesting.
It turned out there was a lot
must
of
have been really funny.
strange twists to the story that I don't know. But that particular documentary is just excellent. And
I'll
you
have to
can
check it
usually
out.
find it on the...
Yeah. And I was thinking, I think one of the Yasui kids also was in military intelligence, and that as well. Yes.
My grandmother lived next to the public place in 3rd Street, so they're broke. And I would come visit her, and all night long, the sirens would go, because every time they went around and there wasn't somebody in a proper place, they would put off the siren to warn people that, looking for
Oh, wow.
somebody that was
Just in the wrong spot, yeah.
in the wrong.
Uh-huh.
They do that all night long.
Oh, man.
Quite frequently.
That would have been annoying.
And the other time, when I was here for the 4th of July, they marched a bunch of the Italians down Higgins Avenue for the parade.
I've seen a picture of a parade with Italians in it, yeah. So they were entertainment for the area. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Just startled you.
I don't know the year, but it wasn't uncommon to see people that were interned at the fort come into town, and I don't remember, they had like gray slacks on, but they always had the prison blouses, or the upper part had stripes on.
Oh.
And in front of the old penny store on Higgins Avenue, they would wait there for the bus, and they ride the bus back to the fort.
Oh, wow. Huh.
And I don't know exactly what year that was, but it was.
I'm not surprised. I think, I don't know the year either, but I'm not surprised by that story because I think for the most part, they didn't really expect anyone to escape because where would you go? Especially for the Japanese because they would have stood out. But there is a story about some Italians getting in the back of I think the Durazi truck and trying to get to the train station, and they got caught. And they said, please take me to jail and not back to the fort because of that hierarchy, you know, with the Italian mayor. And they didn't want to deal with getting in trouble with the Italian ship captain. They were like, no, just take us to jail, please. So. Any other questions or? When did it all end? Well, the end of the war. So after. The Italians got to leave a bit earlier I think before Italy surrendered, but maybe right around when Italy surrendered. And I'm a bad historian because I remember stories and not dates. So, but the camps closed. That's tricky because the main camps we talked about closed with that verdict just before the verdict of in that Mitsui Endo case. Which I'm really bad at this. 44, I think. The war, I think they basically closed in 44. However, the camps where our guys were persisted a lot longer. And so, like Mr. Yasui went from here to Oklahoma and Louisiana and ended up in Crystal City. And he wasn't reunited with his family until 3 or 4 months after the war itself had completely ended. And so there were some folks that had been on that FBI list that were still detained for several months after the war was over. And then many of them were still visited by the FBI for years into the future. Mr. Shimoda, he was a younger guy who was here at Fort Missoula, and he was visited by the FBI. They're basically on parole, so they had to check in either with a parole officer or an FBI officer, even though they hadn't ever been convicted of a crime. And some of them talked about having kind of paranoia, or their families perceived it as paranoia, because they were always afraid the FBI was going to catch them doing something wrong. Okay. Well, I would like to say if you are folks who like online exhibits, we do have an online exhibit of the Looking Like the Enemy exhibit. The Looking Like the Enemy exhibit is up at the fort until next
spring. So there is still time to go see it.
So you can come walk around. There's a wealth of information that we didn't get to today there, specifically about the Japanese. We're going to continue to have programs at the fort where, especially in the fall, we'll probably do some more programming around this subject as well.
You can also request a tour with Christiana here around the grounds. And so
we can do it at whatever pace you want. We can drive to spots. Tours are free. I just like telling stories. So, okay, well, thank you guys for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming and speaking. I can confirm I was at the fort just like a week or two ago, looked at the exhibit, great exhibit. So recommend you all check it out. And I just wanted to remind you before we all leave about, we do this once a month. So in April, our program is Flathead Lake Biological Station History.